Welcome to Grape Culture. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Tony.
Sarah,
Tony.
but what is grape?
Is this grape?
Is this grape? So, why did we want to do a comedy, a tragic comedy about the concept of grape culture? This is what we're going to talk about in today's Virgin episode. We will be popping some cherries today about not only the show Grape Culture that we are performing, but also the concept of grape culture and why we wanted to make art content and comedy around it. So, Sarah, tell me, what do you think grape culture is? Define it in your own terms.
Grape culture exists because domination without consent is what our entire world functions on. If we just zoom into the US government alone, I have this theory that the government is a narcissist and we're all its codependent little bitches. And it dominates us until we follow the rules and do what they say, which is pretty similar to how grapists operate in the world, right? They don't want you to set boundaries. They don't want you to have autonomy. They don't want you to have your own ideas and thoughts and feelings about what could work or not work. Grape culture fundamentally requires us to follow the rules, obey, and be really good girls and boys and people so we don't get in trouble. And if we don't follow those rules, and even if we do, we're still dominated.
Okay, so when I think about grape culture and what it means to be a culture, I think of a psychology and I think of a consciousness. And so the consciousness of grapiness and why I think it's the culture, period. It's not just a part of culture. It's not just something that shows up in pockets of society. It actually is the very foundation of which society functions. And that, I agree with you, I think when we say the word narcissist, I'm like brought to the medical industrial complex and diagnosing. But what I think is very relevant when we come to like a psychological understanding of why people dominate without consent, it has to do with only being concerned about the self and one's own like pleasure, preference, and priority. Like it's an over prioritization of the self. And so these systems that over prioritize the system rather than the citizenship of which they are serving.
Yeah. Like narcissism fundamentally, like narcissism, yes, as a pathological word to describe a set of personality traits, character traits, and expressions. But really at the core of it, narcissism being this lack of self-awareness and this vampiric approach to life where the narcissistic energy is at the center and it has to suck and take and feed, and there's no regenerative quality to that, which is so anti the way that the earth works and biology works and the mycelium networks work. Like it's so grape culture is so anti-life.
Yes. And it is the essential organizing principle of patriarchy.
Yes.
So when we are to look at society, and I think a lot of people still bristle at the word patriarchy. A lot of people will hear this concept of rape culture and still not get what I mean or what you mean by a culture, right? So they think of rape as this very, grape. Oopsie doopsie. They think of grape as a very specific definition that's purely a sexual act in the physical form. And that definition is also very violent and very specific, right? It's like how Hollywood has defined grape is extreme. It is someone in the alley with a knife to their throat. It is Jodie Foster in the movie Accused, where there's like 7 guys graping her for a 10-minute gory scene. And so when we have a definition of grape that is very extreme, then on a personal level, when we compare our own stories to that, we're like, oh, yeah, well, I wasn't gang raped by 100 soldiers. So maybe what happened to me doesn't even matter. I mean, that is the way we have come to minimize our own pain is by comparing our pain to something that's so cataclysmic. And I think that is grape culture, right? So grape is one thing, but grape culture is another. Grape culture is the psychology that makes us doubt our own violence, our own experience with violence, makes us minimize our own experience with violence because we are comparing it to something else. So that is a culture of grape.
Right. And narcissism needs gaslighting to function. So the commodification of grape and Hollywood showing us and feeding us and telling us what is and isn't grape then is imprinting into our personal psychology and orientation of how we then process and digest our own experiences. And I think there's so many people out there who actually have survived grape culture. I mean, I think when we zoom this out to the larger context of like grape culture isn't a part of culture, it is our culture. Like even our taxes can be grapey. Like getting up and having to go to work to make a certain amount of money to then pay for your life is inherently grapey, and then being gaslighted that you're not working hard enough in order to make the amount of money in order to live. Like this is all of the gaslighting and the narcissism and the graping that isn't necessarily sexual assault, or it doesn't even require someone to touch you with their hands. There is this psychology and this energy that is the perpetration, that is the imprint in the quantum field that precedes the actual act of what we think of as more classical graping.
Yes. Okay, so I think what you're bringing up is important to remind people because specifically when we mention grape culture or we mention a show about grape culture, a lot of people might respond, oh, well, I've never personally been graped, so I don't know how this applies to me. And I think that is exactly what we want to address and unpack. You may never have experienced the quote unquote sexual graping, but that in no way means that you are not experiencing grape culture in every interaction you have with every single system. Like you are mentioning with capitalism and like you are mentioning with the workforce and like you are mentioning with taxes, we are not consenting to where our taxes go. I do not consent for my taxes to support the war machine. However, that is what's happening. And when I talk about that on social media and people say, oh yeah, but you're supporting the politician that, no, I actually didn't support that politician. I didn't vote for that person. And that person is being lobbied. That person is beholden to a capitalist system and is beholden to Wall Street. That is grape culture. And that is what like people need to start unpacking is that if you think grape is something that just applies to some poor 16-year-old who got too drunk at a party, you are not getting the memo that every single one of us is being graped constantly by the systems that rule us. And that when we allow that, we are just going to inherently allow fathers to grape their daughters or husbands to grape their wives or uncles to grape their nieces and nephews. And the grapes happen in the personal because we allow it in the macro.
Yeah. And I think over the last couple of years, especially on social media, there's been this conversation around divesting from systems of oppression. And the root of that, like, need to do that is because we are all complicit in upholding and continuing to co-create grape culture in the same way that we are also upholding and complicit in suffering, of course, at different levels of access and privilege and intersections of that. Like it's not a blanket statement, but those of us especially who have the privilege to even be able to press play on something like this and listen to it, have the time and space to examine where are we complicit in these systems of oppression, and how is grape culture sort of the overall overarching umbrella and then like deepest root that all of these systems of oppression continue to like feed on, survive from. Like it is the blood root. Grape culture is the blood root of all systems of oppression. Like even when it comes to the diaspora of certain peoples, or the rise of the first most ancient state of Mesopotamia, the rise of the state could not have formed if women and people's bodies were not taken as casualties. P.S. There's no such thing as casualties. There's just human bodies that are used in the creation of the war machine, and in this case, the creation of the state. If women hadn't been abducted, if people hadn't been abducted who had fucking uteruses, who were able to then conceive and birth life to create class, like the state wouldn't have been able to exist without graping. Graping is at the foundation of the state, period. The state is also not needed. The state itself is symbolic of the graping and the control. If it had to be created through graping, then it didn't need to ever exist in the first place.
Yes, and what we are referencing when we look at the systems of how we self-organize is that if the foundation of those systems are about domination without consent, we are not allowed to grow our own land because we have to, quote, own land. We have to own property. We have no freedoms without being given a birth certificate or some sort of taxation. We have to be part of the system because if we are not, we will be arrested. I mean, and that has been the foundation of society for millennia. And that is not with our consent. We just are born into the system and we comply. Compliance is not consent. Laying back on the bed while somebody grapes you is not consent. That is just acquiescing to an act that you're waiting for it to be over. And so we, as citizens of the earth, are almost waiting for our lives to be over while the system penetrates us without our consent, demanding our blood, demanding our time, demanding our finances, demanding our children for soldiers of war, demanding our bodies. Like, this is the foundation of how we have chosen to organize within this capitalist property owning system. And that is what we want to untangle. However, we've really kind of talked a lot about the macro ideas. Let's get a little bit into the micro, into our own personal stories of why this was important for us to make work on. So, Sarah, what is your personal driving ethos and why you want to be making work about this?
I'm stuck on like the acquiescing and like the waiting for it to be over. And I think when I reflect on my personal grapes, which range from, casual sexual assault in the workplace, which has been so normalized, to like violent drugging, graping, blood, vomit, the whole nine yards. I think about in all of these situations, no matter how minor or extreme, how the common thread of acquiescing for me was literally trying not to get killed or die. Like the acquiescing, or like the things that I had to say or do to get out of these certain situations, play the game, they say, was to literally not die. And that was always at the forefront of my nervous system. And I'm now a somatic practitioner, a trauma practitioner, a spiritual practitioner, on top of being an artist of many forms and passions. And part of the reason I even got into that work is because after all of these grapes, I was living in a perpetual state of fight or flight. I literally could not exist in a state in my nervous system of parasympathetic rest and digest. I was addicted to cortisol. And then after all of these grapes, starting with my earliest childhood sexual abuse, I had to reteach myself that I did not have to, like, my core program and mode did not have to be my prefrontal cortex looking out and waiting for the next predator that was going to come in and take something from me. And so I started making this work and I started my healing journey because I literally probably was going to die. Like, I started to be diagnosed with multiple autoimmune disorders. I was getting full body eczema. I couldn't walk up the stairs, and I was like 22 years old. I couldn't walk up the stairs without holding onto a railing because my joints hurt that bad. Like, my body was shutting down. So I started making work about this when I was in grad school at Duke. And then I simultaneously started studying trauma somatics in the body so that I could heal my nervous system and continue to make this work so that I had the agency to make a different choice, not only about how I could exist within my own body, but then exist in the world in relationship to other people. And so that is my personal orientation, and it continues to shift the deeper we get into this work.
Yeah, I just want to take pause and hear that because, you reflecting that fear is real. So I do feel that in my heart as someone who loves and cares for you. For me personally, my story around my interest about Grape was initially about other people. I actually was my own biggest Grape denier. I did not see myself as a victim of Grape. I denied all these grapey events that happened to me. I forgot. I truly let myself forget about attempted grapes. I had explained away so many grapey things that I did not see myself as a person who experienced grape at all. So my initial journey around this topic had to do with my genuine love and concern for other women who I was very close to who had experienced grape, and feeling that I wanted to do work around this because I wanted to do it for them. I wanted to be like a voice that I felt at that time was untouched by this subject, so I could talk about it. I could make comedy about it. I could make sketches. I could do stand-up. I could write about it. I could do all this work around Grape because I thought I was doing it for other women because I never once realized I was doing it for myself. It just truly wasn't clear to me. So I don't think I ever personally, even in all my grapiest of times, even in a lot of my grapiest memories are actually when I was unconscious, which is interesting. So my most grapiest experiences I was physically unconscious for. However, even the grapey experiences that I was perfectly awake for, I was never afraid, which is so bizarro. I was never afraid at all, actually. And I'm just realizing this at this exact moment when you mentioned your fear. So I'm wondering why I think my denial was just so strong, perhaps, that I wasn't in a place of fear. But I'm not sure why. That's really something to think about. But I do think what's interesting is that allowing your I mean, I don't even want to say like allowing one's body because no one allows one's body to be great. Witnessing one's body being great, that's a much better word. Witnessing grapey things happening to one's body, right? It doesn't need to be terrifying to be violating. You don't need to fear your life to be violated.
Yeah.
Which is, even as I say that, I'm like, wait, what? Why did I do? I mean, we could go on and on about why things happen, but I'm struck by the fear that you mentioned, and then I am equally struck by my own lack of fear. And then also how long it took me to realize, oh wait, whoa, hashtag me too. It really was hashtag me too that made me come to terms with my own Me Too.
What immediately hits me is like having specifically the imprint of early childhood sexual abuse and the way that the nervous system and the brain are so mushy-gushy, especially before age 7. And like receiving all of these OG codes around how to be in relationship with self and the world. And I think that my fear, like when you say that, I can feel that fear like so deeply connected to my inner child specifically. Because then, as these things continued to happen, and as I started making work about this before Me Too happened, my fear started to disintegrate as I started to be more vocal about this, because as I started to speak about it, I got a huge response on the internet with other women and people coming forward being like, wow, you sharing your story is inspiring me to share my story. And then my fears started to get dismantled in direct relationship to the power of community coming together to be like literally Me Too. And we were all creating the Me Too movement before it happened on social media. Like, I even think the Me Too movement, like when that emerged and how that happened, like it had already been commodified by the time the parade started. Not to say that the protests and the parades and all of that weren't powerful, but by the time it reached that level of like global recognition, capitalism already had grabbed it and had all of these symbols to identify what this thing was. But we had all been creating that. It's similar to what happened also with Black Lives Matter. Like, there were so many of us already divesting from white supremacy and having these conversations before, like, the internet then took that and made it this thing that was, like, outside of our bodies and on a screen for us to then engage with and use identity politics to be a part of it, instead of, like, the grassroots community story sharing feet on the ground.
Well, I would argue that the internet did not do that. No, the internet was a platform of which to continue to do this sharing. The commodification or the co-opting that you're mentioning is different. And that, I think, is a reaction when something is seen as powerful as a way of taking the power away by co-opting, by colonizing.
Yeah.
So I do think Me Too was colonized, along with Black Lives Matter, along with any movement becomes colonized because people see an opportunity, because there is a grassroots energy. But the grassroots energy was and always will be pure.
Yeah.
The internet is not pure or impure, right or wrong. The internet is. It's how the internet is used and how the internet is censored and how the internet is silenced and how bots participate in the internet. I mean, I think you were to really look into it, a huge amount of interaction online is bots communicating to bots, and how we don't even know what troll programs are out there to ignite division, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people used Me Too as an opportunity to divide, but at its root core, I think it was actually a bigger opportunity to redefine the definition of what grape is. Because that's why, the Aziz Ansari conversation was interesting. That's why we were using celebrity culture, because celebrity culture was a reference point that everyone could touch on, right? Everyone kind of understood Louis C.K. Everyone knew these characters. So gossip, right? We were all gossiping about celebrity because that was a frame of reference we could all hold. And of course, gossip is always it's considered a sin, I think, but gossip is a way for women to talk to each other and warn each other about predators. Gossip is actually a very important part of safety when you live in community. So we were gossiping about quote unquote celebrity culture because that gave us that point of reference. But like, for instance, the Louis, we could now all talk about an act of grapiness where he was not pinning anyone down. He didn't have a gun to anyone's head. He wasn't doing anything overtly violent, yet the act itself felt very violent to the women that experienced it. And then everyone had to talk about, well, is it violent for a guy to jerk off at you? What is that? And so that, I thought, awoke a conversation. Aziz Ansari also, that was a very we could say gray area, right? He was a famous person that had power over somebody, but he did not feel powerful. He felt like a nerdy guy who hadn't fucked a lot of chicks in his life. And now that he had money, he had the opportunity to get chicks hotter than his previous pay grade. And so he felt entitled to their bodies because he had money. He felt entitled to her sex because he bought dinner. And like, I think that's why the point that she made in the article when she said, I hadn't even finished my wine when he asked me to come home. And a lot of people on the internet were like, oh, you dumb bitch. Like, who cares? Why are you caring about wine? No, what she's referencing is his complete lack of curiosity and concern about her experience at dinner. A date, an actual date where someone cared about your body and your humanity would be like, oh, are you finished with your meal? Would you like to come back to my house so we could consensually share our bodies and check in? He wasn't even checking in if she was done eating. He's not going to check in if he can eat her puss. You know, like that is grape culture, right? That is the psychology of not being curious or concerned. But so we all got to talk about that.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have had those conversations necessarily because these conversations are so private. These were public displays for us all to have the same frame of reference of which to discuss. And that is why I think Me Too was so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, when I reflect on that period of time, it was like almost an overnight shift in tone, not just from what I was receiving on the internet, but what I was receiving from people in my life, like family members, close friends. When the cultural movement around Me Too happened, it was like, oh, no wonder Sarah's been talking about this shit. Mm-hmm. She's actually not just some crazy bitch who's just trying to like drag up all this stuff from the underworld. Like, this is actually happening to so many people everywhere. And the gossip piece is really interesting because the etymology of the word gossip is God sip. And it was sometime around when, I guess it was like the 300 years of witch burnings in Europe that this came about, where like God sip was then transferred into the word gossip and then demonized because they didn't want women, witches who were non-Christians, to be spreading misinformation. What does that sound like? Misinformation around the town about the truth of God and Jesus and morals and values. So they had to demonize this thing, God sip, sipping the word of God, women literally exchanging their like divine channel and information and what they're receiving and what they're sensing and what they're picking up on, because that also is in such direct like tension with the way that grape culture requires us to question ourselves and gaslight ourselves. So we are gaslighted from birth in our mother's wombs. And then we are born thinking that the gaslighting is normal. And then we immediately are put into all of these systems where we start gaslighting ourselves. And then we are gaslighting each other. Like the amount of women who also gaslight each other, like, well, was it really that bad? Men certainly have said this to me, but I have definitely had women be like, well, what happened to you really that bad? Like, what level of grape happened? Like, was it like, but I know that's coming from their own self-denial of the things that have happened to them. So this denial is a self-protection. Mm-hmm. And in order to break open that, I think something like the Me Too movement needed to happen, because all of us coming together to be like, whoa, like, look at the shared nature of our stories, because we actually are all one, was deeply empowering, and starts to just disintegrate that self-protection, that instinct to self-protect.
Yes. And it's not just the shared stories to feel as if you are part of something. It's also the shared stories for you to have a body reaction to someone else's story. And then the empathy and compassion you have for their story and what happened to them, you can then bring into your own story. There are so many things that I have allowed to happen to my body, to my emotional self, that I do not question. However, if someone I loved told me that story, I would feel upset for them. And so we got to start talking about stories where compassion and empathy were elicited for another person. At least this is the way my brain works. And when my brain was eliciting compassion and empathy for these stories, was I then able to look at my own stories and turn that back to me? and say, oh, wow, I also deserve compassion, understanding, and curiosity about these events that happened to me. And I do remember the thing that I had felt. I mean, I have all these naive belief systems, but one of the naive belief system I felt during Me Too was the potential of the true revolution, because I was like, oh, if every single person who committed a grapey act was held accountable for their actions, we would have the revolution. All the CEOs, all the religious leaders, all the politicians, all the people in power, all the businessmen, if all of these people literally, and I mean literally, I'm not just like literally, if they were held accountable for their grapey actions, if the justice system actually gave justice to the victims of Grape, we would have a revolution. And yet that wasn't what happened. Instead, we had iconic representatives of Grape, then the Bill Cosby, the Weinstein, whomever. We have these icons then put away. And then everyone's like, it's over. We fixed it. And that is, I think, the point I make over and over every single time some celebrity gets accused of Grape. The point I make on the internet is the same. This is incredibly common. This isn't an anomaly. This is super common. This is happening all the time. This is happening in your neighborhood. This is happening in your church. This is happening in your family. This is happening in your ecosystem. So whatever pearl clutching and finger pointing we're doing, go back to your own personal life and see where this is happening and has happened.
I want to ask this question. I don't know if this will take us too far off, but it's like, what does restorative justice look like outside of the prison industrial complex as we have seen it? Like, what does it look like to actually hold rapists accountable? Like, you know, the immediate thing that comes forward for me is like, well, a removal of their power. And maybe, you know, that's not for us to answer here today, but I just like feel it hanging in the field. Like,
No, that
what
is hanging.
I also feel like the compassion piece is interesting because it's like, if rapists were fundamentally tapped into compassion, which requires curiosity and understanding, they could not continue to be complicit in these cycles of abuse, which is where the narcissism comes back in connection to rapists. Because if narcissism is fundamentally a lack of self-awareness, then how could you have compassion for self or another without that awareness, without that realization? Which is why when we were interviewed outside of the gates of Harvard and you were asked, like, what is required to move through these times, you said a spiritual revolution. And so many people all over the internet resonated with that, including myself, because, and that feels like an obtuse answer, but just like, you know, reapproaching what the justice system actually looks like, and that being a 6-part episode, so is the fact that we need a spiritual revolution, because we will not heal without self-realization.
Yas. And so I think to conclude, now that we've lubed, to conclude this first Here Now episode, I would like to both speak our intentions of doing this work, not only doing the show, Grape Culture, a tragic comedy, but also this podcast. And I believe we're going to land on the same answer. I will answer first, and then you may answer second. But my intention, my objective, my passion is about healing. It's about my own healing. It's about sharing my own healing, but it's also about participating in a vibration of healing. And I do not think we are going to heal grape culture by blaming, shaming, and adding to a vibration of domination without consent. However, that does not mean we cannot be angry. That does not mean we cannot be harsh. That does not mean we cannot have fury. There is space for our anger. There is space for our fury. There is space for our rage. And there is space for our compassion. And the healing is the choreography of how we dance with all these emotions in order to genuinely process these feelings and heal.
Thank you. I resonate. And yeah, shame is a program. Shame is a program and shame is a weapon. And it is not the way that we heal ever, 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 ever. My intention with this podcast is to create a space for taboo conversation. Like, I can even feel in what we've spoken today, some people listening may have never even had this conversation with themselves or with other people or don't know where to start. Also, as someone who grew up in the evangelical Christian South with a history teacher who gave out extra credit when you joined Young Republicans Club, who was a Civil War reenactor, I certainly was not given much language to even investigate what it was that I had survived, which is why I didn't come to terms with my own early childhood sexual abuse until pretty recently, like years after starting to do this work, 10 years after starting to do intense EMDR therapy and working with countless therapists and practitioners and yada, yada, yada. So to create space for taboo conversation that should not be taboo. And like, I deeply also feel like yes, yes, yes to the healing, and yes, yes, yes to acknowledging that sacred rage and sacred grief are not only so valid, but they're also specifically faces of the goddess that I think we have forgotten. The goddess is not just peace and love and harmony and pleasure and beauty. She is also rage and fury. They are also rage and fury and the underworld and the bugs and the spiders and the snakes and the venom that's the poison, but also the medicine. And so I'm excited to get gnarly here. And my intention is to get gnarly and to also get a little gross and pervert the pretty, as we say. You know, like I feel like there's so much projection that happens around women and the feminine and people who even approach these conversations in the first place, where it's like, oh, well, if you were just a little more palatable, and if you dressed a little more different, and if you looked more like a state representative, then people would take you seriously. But my intention is to actually come up against all of that programming and actually ask, why do you think that? Is that an original thought that you had, or is that a program that someone inserted into your subconscious mind like a cassette tape? Because those programs will continue to play until you, as your higher self, as the one who has your thoughts, decides to divinely disrupt that tape and have your own heart thought. So my intention is spiritual awakening.
And then with that, I do want to add a caveat that because our objective is to have these gnarly conversations, and we are not censoring this podcast, we are not censoring this conversation, we are not editing, we are not cutting. We are just giving you ourselves raw dog. We are raw dogging you as an audience. Because we are, hopefully with consent, may we not use a condom. May we not use an energetic condom with you, audience.
The play is the consent. You're an adult. It's up to you.
Yes. So if we're going to completely uncensor ourselves, we may make mistakes. We may say things that we disagree with later. We may have to reflect. We may have to come back. We may change our minds. And I think that is very important, that we may change our minds. We may say yes, and then we may say no. And that is okay. And I think it is okay for us to say, oh, oopsie, I said that thing. And then like I reflected on it. And 3 weeks later, I've come back. Or perhaps we say this thing and then people on the internet reflect that, oh, this is why what you thought and said was problematic. And we are then educated by this feedback, and then we receive the education and then we move on. Like, this is the culture that we need to embody in how we have these conversations, because if we're going to get messy, we have to take a risk. And part of taking that risk is that we will be misinterpreted, we will be misunderstood, we may speak something that is offensive, we may feel sorry, we may not feel sorry, we may feel fine, we may regret, or we may not regret. And I want to leave space for all of it. And I hope that you, as the audience, also give us that space to get gnarly, to get messy, to get bloody, to get real, to get raw, because then you will give that to yourself in your own life. And then you will have conversations and you will have connections and you will have moments with people where you allow for things to get gritty, messy, confusing, and also to say yes and then say no, and to have space for all of that, because that is what consent is. It's the continual checking in and curiosity of the other person's experience. Ah!
And that is how we heal. Like,
Yeah.
you gotta vomit, you gotta shit. It has to come out. Like, you can't, healing is not a sanitized experience. It can't be choreographed. And perfectionism is also inherently white supremacist and patriarchal. Patriarchal?
Yeah, it's abuse. Perfectionism is self-abuse.
Yeah.
So this is not going to be perfect.
No.
Yes. But I'm glad we're here, and I'm glad we're doing this. And I think this is a really groovy introduction to what our vibe is and what this is going to be about. And in future episodes, we're going to do our best to be specific about topics in order to get into the weeds of grape culture and our own stories and the stories of that we find grapey and interesting.
The way that you hold space for other people is reflective of the way that you hold space for yourself.
Yeah.
So I do want to set like a strong, fierce Kali Ma, sacred mama boundary around like, this is an offering, and this is generous, and it's brave, and it's vulnerable, and we are open, and we are also boundaried and busy.
Open, boundaried, busy, but ready to connect.
And booked. And ready to book more.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, audience members, for being a part of this journey with us. I am excited to come together with you as we go into this very heavy, intense, important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.